Yes, there are even more Five Nights at Freddy's books, and we're here to talk about them. Today we embark on the journey of chronicling every piece of timeline-relevant lore I can find in the Tales from the Pizzaplex book series. Now, I know that some of you are thinking, well, all of the lore is relevant because these books take place in-game, but do they? We're going to have that conversation too. So Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake some literary analysis. You know, it really doesn't have the same ring as theory. So what did I mean by that last remark? Similarly to the Fazbear Frights debate, there's a significant chunk of the fan base that believe all of these stories to not be separate stories, but in fact exactly what happens in the in-game timeline of Five Nights at Freddy's. Especially since in the books it's established there are multiple pizzaplexes, so not all of these stories necessarily need to take place at the same one. The evidence used for the side of the argument that the books are in continuity with the games are typically what Scholastic has said about the books, what Scott has mentioned, and the contents of the books themselves. Scholastic has described these books as taking place within the setting and universe of Five Nights at Freddy's, exploring uncharted corners of the game's canon and things like that. I myself have argued against these lines in the past, and the best way I could explain how is with an analogy. When the Mario movie was coming out, the Universal website promoting the movie described it as a movie that takes place within the setting of the Mario games. And that's a true statement. Those movies take place in the Mario games setting. But nobody would argue that this movie takes place within the same continuity of the Mario games. That doesn't make a lot of sense with what both the games and the movie establish as lore. And that's the key here, because taking place within the same setting as something doesn't mean it takes place within the same continuity. After all, fanfiction takes place within the same setting as its source material, and that's obviously not canon. But to go even more officially, The Silver Eyes, a series of books which everybody pretty much agrees do not take place in the games, do take place in the setting of the games. Five Nights at Freddy's, the characters of Freddy's and Fazbear exist, so do the locations. These are the same settings, but different stories told within them. So what of the content itself? Well, much of the argument comes from the fact that there are one-to-one locations that carry over from book to game, and that there are characters from the books that carry over one-to-one as well, namely Gregory and the Mimic. Many people argue that since these locations and characters line up so exactly with the games, they might as well be considered to be in the same continuity. And that's a valid argument. I totally understand the camp of people who believe these books to be in the same continuity of the games. It does make a lot of sense, regardless of what I think. So with all this debate, what has Scott said on the matter? Of course, a whole bunch of nothing. In fact, within the past few months, somebody faked an email from Scott Cawthon confirming the books to be in continuity, which then prompted to have Scott come onto the internet on that Reddit post and leave a comment. He confirmed that the email was fake and then continued with, concerning what people have been saying about the canonicity of the books, yes, that is correct. A classic Scott troll. Literally, everyone was saying, I think the books are in continuity, I think the books are not in continuity. And Scott said, referring to what everyone is saying, yes. Thanks, Scott. Gloriously unhelpful as always. So regardless of where you land on this, what actually changes in the timeline if these books are in continuity 100%? Well, there are some dates that get weird and don't line up super well, but the main changes to the timeline itself, if the books are in continuity, would be that the Mimic's kill count is higher than we see in-game, and that Edwin Murray created the Mimic. And other than that, I can't see a lot of direct changes to the timeline if the books are in continuity. So going into this, where do I land? What do I think of these books and how they can help us solve the FNAF timeline? Personally, I do not think there's compelling enough evidence to definitively say these books are within the same continuity of the games, and I don't feel comfortable making that claim. So personally, I'm going to treat the Pizzaplex books the same way that we treated Fazbear Frights, and to an extent the Silver Eyes. I'm not taking these stories as direct things that happened in-game, but rather, these stories are meant to inform us about things that could have happened in the same universe, and teach us about some characters that may cross over. So let's get to it. And there's a lot of short stories in this series, and previously, when we did Fazbear Frights and Tales from the Pizzaplex, I just kind of pointed out the main issues of lore from those books and moved on. The nature of these stories kind of make it easier if I just briefly go over each story that seems relevant, and I'll pin things as we go. But judging from the length this video is probably going to be, it's going to be a two-parter. So in this part of this little mini-series and a mini-series, we'll be going over every non-mimic story in Tales from the Pizzaplex. So all of the other things these books teach us about, because a big majority of these books is focused on the mimic. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, I've got terrible news for you. You're not going to learn today. And One more note before we get into it. When I did the lore videos for the Silver Eyes and Fazbear Frights, I kind of forgot to do the lore corkboard, or as I'll be calling it going forward, the Lorkboard. So here's the Lorkboard. Here's the Silver Eyes and Fazbear Frights. Now we can start doing Tales from the Pizzaplex. And one final PS, not all the stories are going to be mentioned from Tales from the Pizzaplex because some of them are just not relevant to the timeline. Perfect example, Bleeding Heart. Disgusting story, really gross, very weird, not super important to the timeline. I'm not going to bring it up. Okay, finally, let's get into the stories. On the top of the list is Frailty, a story about a girl who has a silver locket that she scrapes metal off of onto hospital patients to make them feel better. But in the end, she loses the locket and turns into a pile of scrap metal and grease. Does this sound familiar? This story is incredibly similar to To Be Beautiful. The lockets are described in a very similar way, they function in a similar way, and some people think Eleanor might have been the one to give this locket to our main character, even though as far as I'm aware, Eleanor does not show up in this story at all. But to be fair, our character does seem to be afraid of a junkyard. But is that because she found Eleanor in one, or because she knows she's made of junk metal? Who knows? Regardless, the locket is definitely made of Remnant, and this story doubles down on the idea that Remnant possesses healing properties. The next story, Under Construction, doesn't have any specific moments, but it sets up a very specific recurring theme that we see in many of these stories. That being the theme of somebody's consciousness being trapped within technology. It seems as though in these stories, when somebody dies inside of an AR or VR machine, their consciousness tends to live on, at least in some way, for some time. Really quickly, in this story, our main character enters a VR machine that essentially gives her the perfect birthday party ever, but when she leaves, what she doesn't know and what we find out later, she's still in the machine. So she goes to live her life still in this machine, and more adults start getting cancer, and more people start giving birth to these weird amorphous blob things. And after a while, she realizes she might be in a machine, but as she's trying to get out of it, more and more of these blobs keep following her and surrounding her until eventually she suffocates underneath them, but she doesn't die. She ends the story wondering how long it'll be until she dies. And in a separate story, we learn that this machine filled up with smoke because it wasn't finished, it was still under construction. So she probably died from suffocation of that smoke, and that's why she was dying in game. But in the game, she hasn't died yet. So again, this story very early establishes even if your body dies, as long as you're in some kind of VR or AR device, your consciousness may live on. And it's worth noting at the beginning of the story, one of the characters calls something like this quantum immortality. So we'll put a pin in there because that's probably definitely important. The next story, Help Wanted, is a crazy story because it's pretty much exactly the story of how Help Wanted as a game was created, or at least how the indie games that inspired Help Wanted were created. Essentially, this story sees Fazbear gaslighting a man into working for their company, making games based off of the things that may or may not have happened at Fazbear, and then they kill him at the end of the story. So how do they do this? Well, it's very interesting, and we see another version of it at the end of these stories in Didophobia. But we don't get exact information. What we do get is that he is in a house controlled by Fazbear, with robots on tracks and scary things and trapdoors and strings to emulate a sort of life for him and emulate these horrible nightmares. The thing is, obviously no one would be tricked by that, but it's established that there's some kind of thing making these things feel real, and a big central point of that is the smoke detector that he eventually breaks, and that's when he sees the illusion. It's interesting that this story sort of preludes Didophobia. We'll get into more details when we get to that story, but essentially in Didophobia, the main character is having hallucinations based off of real mannequins because of hallucinogenic gas coming from the ceiling. And we look at this, if a smoke detector is on your ceiling, that's a perfect place to vent in gas if it's not a real smoke detector. Regardless, the main information for the timeline here is twofold. One, Fazbear has the technology of either illusion discs, hallucinogenic gas, or probably both. And two, the indie dev they hired to make these games, they tricked into doing so with this technology and then killed him when he was done, or when he found out too much. And before we move on, I have an old friend that I found in storage the other day. Frebby is back, baby. The next story is Pressure, which is a wild story again because it features a roleplay section of the Pizzaplex that reenacts the horrible allegations against Fazbear. And at this point, even if I'm just a customer in this universe and Fazbear didn't do all these horrible allegations, at this point I just think they did because they are so open about it. Notably, this story, the kids are doing a reenactment of the Fazbear Frights location of FNAF 3, and one of them has to play Springtrap. And it's revealed that one of the creepy workers replaced the costume of Springtrap with a real Springlock suit, so then he could use the costume to go, like, kill a kid or something. So for one, Fazbear is doubling and tripling down on saying, hey, these are fake allegations, but let's embrace them, which is a weird thing to do. But two, where the fuck does this Springtrap actual Springlock suit come from? Like, why does some random Pizzaplex worker named fucking Earl have the actual Springlock suit for Springtrap? Or at least a recreation of it that is a Springlock suit. Like, I know there are Springlock suits at the Pizzaplex according to these stories, but one that looks like Springtrap is crazy. Bobby Dot's Part 1 is a very important story for those who argue that these books are within continuity, because this story and its follow-up feature a lot of direct locations from the games, and that's part of the ammunition for that argument. But because it tells us so much about these locations, it's also worth bringing up here. For instance, it gives us the explanation that Sun and Moon were not the original daycare attendants, but were rather part of a stage performance, and they were shifted there to become the daycare attendant. And the reason the generators are in the daycare is to keep the power on, and the structures were already there, so they just threw the generators in the play structures, and I'm sure OSHA has no problems with that. They do. The next one is GGY, and it's a massive one because it goes into the backstory of everyone's favorite problem child, Gregory. Essentially, this story follows a child who is looking into this mystery centering around an arcade player going by the moniker of GGY. And after doing some more digging, he finds out that the animatronics themselves have had their codes adjusted, and the new code has G's and Y's all throughout it. So whoever this is very important. And eventually, Gregory, or Greg as we see in the story, ends up killing this kid who's been looking really into what GGY is doing. In this story, it is exceedingly clear that Gregory is under the control of Glitchtrap. He calls himself the wizard's favorite apprentice. He goes by the codename Dr. Rabbit. So it seems like this story is telling us that patient 46 from Security Breach is Gregory, the therapy patient who was killing off therapists and seemed just pretty evil. Another thing worth noting is that if this story is correct, Gregory personally modified the codes of the animatronics. Nexi as a story isn't incredibly important, but it does bring up a pretty interesting topic. If you want to know what the story is about, just go watch Ron's Gone Wrong. I'm not saying it's plagiarized or anything, but like, it's crazy how similar these stories are. Anyway, I bring up this story because it's an example of an animatronic trying to become human. Essentially, the Nexi doll wants to look beautiful and perfect and doesn't. So it keeps begging the main character, Astrid, to fix her and make her look nicer, but eventually, she begs Astrid to go to the Pizzaplex extra parts room and get all the parts necessary to make Nexi perfect. And they build basically a full new endoskeleton. And once they do, it's implied that Nexi kills Astrid, puts Astrid's body over the perfect endoskeleton, and then Nexi implants her own programming into that endoskeleton, so she can be the perfect, beautiful girl. So again, I mainly bring this up for the point of recurring theme that animatronics want to become human. Drowning as a story has two things worth bringing up. One, it again doubles down on the idea of a character seemingly continuing to live in a VR game after their body has died. It's a little unclear on the timeline here, and it does seem like she dies at the end of the story in both the game and in real life, but there's a possibility here that her body dies immediately, but her consciousness is trapped for a long time. The other thing worth bringing up is that some people theorize the girl from Drowning, the ghost girl, the spirit who's trying to kill this main character, could be Cassidy. Admittedly, there's not a lot of evidence for this. The main topics that get brought up is that she's loosely compared to a princess, kind of, and that she's a girl associated with drowning, the only other one we have being Cassidy. But if you want more information on why that is possible, just refer to the back half of this video. The next important story worth bringing up is B7-2. I didn't talk about B7 because I don't want to. Frankly, don't want to talk about either of them. But B7-2 is incredibly important to bring up, so we will briefly touch on it. Throughout the story of B7, Billy gets several modifications done to his body to become more like an animatronic, and he eventually kind of maybe dies. But it's revealed in the beginning of B7-2 that he didn't die. He's in fact rescued, and all of those modifications come off of his body in one piece. Billy himself starts doing physical therapy and begins the process of healing and getting some actual prosthetics to replace his missing limbs, but those older modifications still have some sort of consciousness, the consciousness of B7, and they're begging Billy to reattach. Eventually, his grandma falls victim to B7, and B7 begins to try to merge with Billy's grandma, until the grandma reveals she knew what was happening all along. She's been talking to B7 over the phone, pretending to not know it's not Billy, but knowing that whatever this is wants to hurt Billy. She herself was terminal and was going to die soon anyway. So she forces B7 to finish merging with her and then dies, killing B7 along with herself, essentially using her last dying abilities to kill B7 and save Billy. So why do I bring up this story? Because it establishes a very important rule in this universe, that a consciousness formed within the mind of someone can be separated from that someone and still persist. Think about the implications of this with someone like Vanny. With this story, it could be implied that Vanny can be removed from Vanessa but still exist on its own. Perhaps that's why Princess Quest 4 works the way it does in Help Wanted 2. The idea that maybe Princess Quest 3 was beaten in Security Breach and Vanessa was freed of Vanny, but Vanny wasn't destroyed, and she lay wait in Princess Quest 4 until somebody good enough comes along to take on her persona. Maybe our character in Help Wanted 2 wasn't good enough, and that's why we see the ending we do at the end of Princess Quest 4. I don't know, that's heavy speculation. But as far as lore information, this story establishes that a consciousness can exist separate from the host it was created in. Our next story is Alone Together, which should sound familiar because I've brought up this story like 10 times on this channel, and I don't want to give another goddamn summary of it, but the point of this video means I probably should. So very briefly, our main character is a boy who nobody likes and nobody wants to talk to, and mostly nobody does talk to. But for his school project, he wants to make a mechanical Turk. It's essentially a wooden box that back in the day was purported to be an automaton that you could play checkers against, but really it was a puppet that somebody was hiding inside of to pretend like it was automaton to play checkers. He's not sure why he's so fascinated about it, but he eventually learns that these memories and wants to build this thing are not his own, but of a ghost that's been possessing him. His grandma tells him that spirits try to affect the memories and dreams of someone to communicate with them. So he hopes that by building this, or by finding the remains of this boy, then maybe, just maybe, he will be able to help this boy move on so he can stop having these visions and these dreams. So he eventually does find the body of the boy inside a mechanical Turk, inside a shed that no one really goes to. He himself then gets trapped, and he realizes that body isn't some boy that's possessing him. That body is his own body. He's dead. And because his remains were undiscovered, he lost the memory of dying. He didn't know he was dead. He was wandering around the places that he spent time in during his life, not realizing that he actually died. But once he finds his body, all of his memories come flooding back, and he's able to find peace. This story is incredibly important for the rules of the universe because it brings up how ghosts seem to work within FNAF. It brings up that wandering spirits can travel through different places they spent while they were alive, not just stay where they died. It brings up that when the body goes undiscovered, a spirit loses its memories and may not even know it's dead. And it brings up that showing a spirit its own remains can help them find peace and possibly move on. So pins for all of that. And finally, for the non-mimic stories, we have Didophobia. It's that FNAF 4 story that I've also made a couple videos about, but essentially, some kid realizes he's in an endless FNAF 4 nightmare, where he relives the actual game of FNAF 4 during the night and wanders around his house during the day, eventually to realize that this is all fake and it's mannequins on tracks again, just like Help Wanted. But this time, after doing some exploring, our main character finds out that it's hallucinogenic gas being pumped into his room. And as he keeps exploring the facility, we find that the grander facility he's within is the sister location bunker. Eventually, he tries to escape, but he has to go back into the rooms he was held in to figure out like a better way to get out and maybe a key or something, and he instead hears an intercom that tells him life is better here, and it's honestly better than it was before he was stuck here. And he eventually agrees, turning the machine back on and going back to bed. And we as the reader find out that this intercom isn't even live, but a tape recording that's triggered to replay if he wanders too far. It's a terrible, dreadful, miserable story. But it's great for lore. It introduces the idea of hallucinogenic gas that I mentioned in Help Wanted, so put a pin there for that. And it also introduces the idea that William Afton was doing experiments very much akin to the FNAF 4 game, or that the FNAF 4 game is based off of nightmares from somebody going through the experiments. There's a lot of ways you could square it away, but it's very much worth mentioning that these chambers are linked directly to the sister location bunker. And that's all the stories that don't really have anything to do with the Mimic, or at least are very loosely connected to it. Like, sure, a lot of these stories are because the Mimic is infecting the Pizzaplex. They don't focus on the Mimic, was the point. All the really Mimic-focused stories and the epilogues we'll cover next week. Regardless, what do you think of the information we've gathered so far? Anything I miss? I'd love to hear your thoughts below. In the meantime, if you missed the earlier timeline videos I've made, they're all in a playlist for your viewing right here. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to share it with #RightHeart. A huge shout out to the best channel members, the Dough Risers, and until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.